marched to the Battle of New Orleans at the end of the early British wars. The young land started growing, the young blood started flowing, but I ain't marching anymore. For I killed my share of Injuns in 1,000 different fights. I was there at the Little Big Horn. I heard many men lying, I saw many more dying, but I ain't marching anymore. It's always the old to lead us to the wars, always the young to fall. Now look at all we've won with the saber and the gun. Tell me, is it worth it all? For I stole California from the Mexican land, fought in the bloody Civil War. Yes, I even killed my brothers and so many others, but I ain't marching anymore. For I marched to the battles of the German trench in a war that was bound to end all wars. Oh, I must have killed 1,000,000 men, and now they want me back again, but I ain't marching anymore. It's always the old to lead us to the wars, always the young to fall. Now look at all we've won with the saber and the gun. Tell me, is it worth it all? For I flew the final mission in the Japanese skies, set off the mighty mushroom roar. When I saw the cities burning, I knew that I was learning that I ain't marching anymore. Now the labor leaders screaming when they close a missile plant. United Fruit screams at the Cuban shore. Call it peace or call it treason, call it love or call it reason, but I ain't marching anymore. No, I ain't marching anymore.
Welcome once again to the Radical Imagination. I'm your host, Jim Vrettos. I'm a sociologist who's taught at John Jay College of Criminal Justice and Yeshiva University here in New York City. In a recent open letter in The Nation, more than 80 activists of the old New Left of the 1960s urged their new left millennial comrades to support Joe Biden in this year's presidential election. The young socialists and progressives were told by their elders that if you yearn for a more equal and just social order, face the facts and differentiate between a capitalist Democrat and a proto-fascist. Don't learn the difference inside a jail cell. Remember the catastrophe that hit German democracy when socialists and communists fought each other in sectarian battles to prove who had the purest message. Who is more papist than the Pope? Hitler snuck by and murdered them all. A recent New York Times op-ed argued that today's privileged young socialists are repeating the irresponsible errors of the New Left of the 60s by refusing to endorse Biden on the basis of doctrinal purity. As the author put it, they'll be responsible if Donald Trump is reelected and morally culpable for the consequences suffered by the less privileged, quote unquote. Taking a principled stand is courageous only when those taking it put themselves at risk. Placing others at risk requires no courage at all. Historically, it has been hard to unite the white progressive left with African American, Latino, and other minority movements on a basis of equality and mutual respect. Second, there's been a tendency for the left to fall into small-minded sectarianism. And third, there are issues of egos and turf battles with people and organizations defending their own narrow organizational interests instead of uniting and building lasting progressive organizations and culture. If there was ever a time for progressives to build a unified movement, this is the time. It may be now or never. We're grateful to have on the show today two of the most astute and prolific writers the left has produced in this country. Mitchell Abidor is a Brooklyn-based translator and historian, widely renowned, as he puts it, in small circles. He's the principal French translator of over 1,000 works for the Marxist Internet Archive, a contributing writer to the last of the left-wing Jewish journals, Jewish Currents, and a frequent contributor to the New York Review of Books. He remains a proud third-generation Brooklynite, living in a decidedly unhip part of Brooklyn, where he was born and raised, and with his wife, the artist Joan Levinson. And he's the author of the New York Times op-ed piece, "These Young Socialists Think They Have Courage. They Don't." And Todd Gitlin is with us also. He's a professor of journalism and sociology and chair of the Ph.D. program in communications at Columbia University. He's a political writer and activist, past president of Students for Democratic Society in 1963 and 4, author of 16 books and 3 novels, a cultural commentator who writes about the mass media, politics and intellectual life, and the arts. He lives in New York City with his wife, Laurel Cook. And he's also one of the signatories to the nation's open letter to the new left from the old new left. Welcome, both of you, to the Radical Imagination. It's great to have you here.
Same here, Jim. Hey, Todd.
Great. And Todd, it's wonderful to have you here too. We want to talk about this open letter and the reaction to it, and your own op-ed piece, and the criticisms, the very acerbic criticisms you got from it, right, Mitch? And then we'd like Todd to comment also on his own experience back in 1963 with Irving Howe and some of the members of the old left at that point. But Mitch, let's start with you. What do you make of the reaction that you received?
Well, I was absolutely flabbergasted. I have to admit that I wrote this piece, and my assumption was I was just writing a comradely criticism, because after the open letter that Todd had signed,
right,
I looked to see how Jacobin had reacted, and it was a pretty shocking reaction. They accused the old new left of scolding them.
Right.
And they took offense at almost everything that in the open letter. I mean, maybe Todd, you want to talk about referring to Max Weber and the things that you said in that letter that set them off.
Right.
Anyway, so
they shamed your letter. Shamed. So this is their response. One of the responses: stop trying to shame socialists into voting for Joe Biden. It's not going to work. And in fact, this was more about you denouncing leftists as irresponsible for the edification of the liberals who are watching.
Yeah, that was one of the many attacks on me. But what was even more shocking was when I told my son that this article was going to be appearing, he warned me, he said, don't worry, I'll be protecting you on Twitter. And I said, protecting me against what? He goes, it's going to be ugly. Just be ready. And I refused to believe that it was actually going to be ugly. But it was. It was absolutely horrific. And physical threats, insults, the usual casual ageism, a couple of people who knew who I was, and they insulted me at least for things I deserved. That I'm an old man who always criticizes everything that the left does, which is absolutely true. And but one person said he was gonna. I'm sorry, I can't talk to you. I'm gonna go kick Abidor's hairless ass. The next day, that was the person who wrote the response in Jacobin. So it gives some idea of the quality of the young left. So it was really an absolutely horrific, awful experience. And I even, frankly, there were moments where I was frightened for my physical well-being, but they also, and this was my favorite part of the whole story, is me, my son, and somebody else that I know who had tweeted a link to my article were put on some list of Nazis, fascists, and red browns. I'm going to give them credit for even knowing what red browns are, frankly, because the kind of, dope who would do something like this, that he should know about communist fascists, was pretty impressive. So it was a really a chastening experience. And as a friend in Australia pointed out to me, God help all of you if these guys ever achieve power, because they're not, the democratic socialists of America means absolutely nothing. And but it also, and this is something we can get to later, because I want to give Todd a chance to talk, was I tried to understand what was going on here, and it got me to reread one of my favorite French thinkers, Gustave Le Bon, who wrote on the crowd mentality. Yeah. And he actually described how Twitter mobs are formed and how they act in 1895. So I've written 2 articles on him as a result of this. So I got something good out of it. But it was a terrible experience. But finally, before turning it over to Todd, and it's something I'd like you to address, Todd, actually, is one of the things that offended me the most was when I looked at the names of the people who signed the open letter, whether I agreed with all of them or not, it made no difference. People like Todd, people like Mark Rudd, people like Kathy Wilkerson, all the other people who signed it, these were people who I might not have agreed with all their actions, certainly not, the Weather Underground was never something that I approved of, but they deserve to be treated with more respect than they were. And the brush off and the insults and the general disdain for the lessons that people, from an earlier generation had learned, just really ticked me off.
Did you experience some of this? What was your experience in 1963 when you met Irving Howe? Was this something that brings you back to some of the things that Mitch is talking about?
Irving was also obsessed with this meeting. He wrote about it, I think, 5 times.
Right.
I've written about it several times. He thought they overreached. That was a word he used. They cared so much about the emergence of a new young left that I think they were offended that this thing, which should have been their continuation, was also dismissive. And in fact, I don't want to go into a lot of detail. Just he didn't understand why Tom Hayden was so angry at him. He thought Tom was a hard-bitten communist type. What he didn't understand was that Tom was an Emersonian. And later, I think this had a lot to do with Irving writing a very fine book about Emerson 10 or 15 years later. He misunderstood, but there was an insight. Leave aside the particulars of the meeting. The sectarian mentality is a Puritan mentality. I don't mean sexually. I mean, it's a refusal to acknowledge complexity. So the sectarian is frightened to admit that he or she harbors complicated or ambivalent notions. He wants or she wants to live in a Manichaean world in which we're the cat's meow and you over there are the devil incarnate. And so the animus, the viciousness with which they differentiate themselves is, I think, psychologically a way of cleansing themselves, of positioning themselves as having clean hands. We know we have clean hands because you guys have the dirty hands. And that's why we're so insistent. That's why we're so inflamed to insult you, to threaten you, and all the rest of it. We've got to push all that away. And I think that is it's a staple of crowd psychology. It's been a long time since I read Le Bon. I don't know if he talks about that element, but the purification is the theme. And it's, by the way, I think in no small measure a fascist theme. The fascist is offended by the emergence of the infectious other, whether that's Mexicans or social democrats or Jews or black people or, you know, transsexual people, whatever. The sectarian cannot live with the ambiguity of the human condition. So I mean, it's depressing that we have to go through this over and over again. I'm encouraged that that spirit is not more widespread than it is. I'm encouraged that we're not hearing the same sort of lunacy about Joe Biden as a running dog of neoliberalism that we were hearing about Hillary Clinton in 2016. I'm encouraged that many fewer people now think it's a smart thing to vote for a third party. And, you know, so I don't think this is the end of the world, but it's a tremendous waste of intellectual, emotional, and moral energy to think that you need to beat up the people who are actually closest to you on the political spectrum, but are in some ways, because they're impure, are threatening your purity. I find this, you know, awfully sad and recurrent.
Very much description of the authoritarian personality that Adorno talked about. So we have the authoritarians on the left and on the right. And
that was actually my beach reading this morning.
You were reading that on the beach?
On the beach, yeah. It's a really hard book to carry in a bag. Trust me.
Some are reading at Manhattan Beach there, right?
That's right.
But I believe AOC has agreed to be on the climate conference or climate committee, policy committee for Joe Biden if he is elected. So
of course she has.
Yeah.
Look, AOC is a very canny and very accomplished, although young, politician. She has to win votes. She has a constituency. She's not running for congresswoman from the planet Mars. She's not running for an academic gold star. She's not running for the sanctification. She's running to make a difference in the way the world does or doesn't get itself together. And so it's, you know, bless her for being a politician. And if, you know, the people who are so up in arms in Jacobin or elsewhere about this sullying of left-wing purity, they're not running in politics. And when they do one, they lose, they get crushed, they get nowhere. Because they're not in it for serious reasons. They're in it for self-aggrandizing, puritanical, self-aggrandizing and moral purification reasons. This is not politics. This is a kind of, I don't know whether it's theology or psychotherapy, but it ain't politics.
Well, you know, in my, in my op-ed piece, I talked about how there was nothing heroic about taking a position when somebody else is going to pay the consequences for your acts. But in fact, their position, I think one person might have said to me, we never claimed we were heroic, because in fact, their position was opportunistic. Because the reason Sankara, the editor of Jacobin, gave for not supporting Biden was, and also DSA was, you know, our goal is to build a socialist movement in America. So it was, as Todd said, there was nothing political about it. And I was wrong. They weren't claiming any heroism. They were just chasing the chimera of a socialist movement that's somehow going to be sweeping across America because they won't support Biden. But there's something at the beginning, at the top of the show, Jim. You were talking about like the three different differences that split us, on the left. You left out a really important one, and that's age. And I know that's something Todd wrote about not too long ago in a public seminar, in the split between the young and the old left today. And it's something that, I've felt over the last 5 years especially. It's been really striking that, with the exception of Bernie Sanders, it's exactly, without the poetry and without the brilliance, it's the Berkeley call of never trust anybody over 30. But and I think that it's something that needs to be thought about, because even in the 60s, that 1963 meeting, Todd, it was the young and the old. There was a generation gap generally across the country. It was also on the left. In May 68 in France, there was also a generation gap on the left. And now it's extraordinarily ugly here. And that's why, so what it is when you wrote your open letter and when I wrote my op-ed, it was another old person telling the young what they should do and think. So ignoring anything that maybe it came out of a lived experience or a knowledge of history, or it's just somebody who's one of them, except I happen to have been born in 1952. And that kind of gets, tossed to the side. And one more thing on the subject of like an age gap is, I was interviewed for an oral history a few weeks ago by somebody who was going to be a junior at Princeton. And she was doing an oral history of Jewish Currents magazine, because I've been writing there for 40 years. And she's 20. And she told me that she has nothing in common with the editors and the publisher of Jewish Currents today, who are all in their mid to late 30s. It's already another generation within that younger generation. So we have three different generations trying to join together. And so you get stuff like the people who are defacing statues of George Washington and Robert Gould Shaw, I'm sure, are the youngest cohort, who are even more obsessed with their own purity. So,
just go back one point on the purity, because it's in the rigidity. I'm just reading this. The last sentence from the open letter from SDS veterans haranguing young socialists to back Biden was a bad idea. Daniel Finn. Sanders should feel guilty about abandoning them and concentrating on building a movement, to back up what I think Todd just said, that is the only real hope for the planet's future. That's it. It's a mindset. This is it. Nothing else can be. So I wonder, Todd, are you feeling the same sort of age gap here with your students at Columbia, or are they seeking you out as someone that they want to learn from and to encourage growth in their mindset?
I don't think it's just a matter of seeking, my wisdom. I mean, conversation I'm all for, and I have a lot of conversation with younger activists, among others. And I think it's to everyone's benefit. I mean, duh. Not just because we know so much, but because we have some questions, we have some experience. There were people older than me who I thought were worth listening to in the 60s, and sometimes I was right, sometimes I was wrong. But building a movement on generational identity is a short-sighted business, because unlike other features of one's identity, age changes if you're lucky, and then you discover that humanity is complicated. But I think it's important to understand that the ferocity of these attacks, it has very little to do with actual politics on the ground. I mean, one thing that gets me crazy is how much energy is going into symbolic politics, like about taking down a statue, than into actually trying to do everything possible to depose a fascist would-be autocrat from the American Republic. And by the way, the real contribution to that effort is, we will see, is being made by the millions of people who marched in the name of Black Lives Matter. Not those waving their purity pamphlets at Jacobin or any other sect. What's changing America is not the drive for purification. It's in fact the experience of amalgamation. We have a movement for Black lives that in which most participants have been white. They are in thousands of cities and towns. That's not a hyperbole. They are a mass movement. They are changing the language, and they may not be changing it to the liking of old or young socialists, but they're real. This is a reality. And so, Bernie Sanders, in a way, heralded a kind of movement. I think some of it is substantial and some of it is not. Those who are serious about power, as he was by running for president, are also serious about recognizing the difference between Donald Trump and Joe Biden. If you can't make that elementary distinction, you should be doing something other than politics. But it shouldn't be medicine, because then you could be operating on the wrong kidney. It shouldn't be law, because then you're going to be screwing up the law books. I don't know what profession. It shouldn't be gardening, because you're going to plant out of season seeds. I mean, this is unreal. I can't, it is just, to me, astonishing that at this moment, when we are an inch from degradation and destruction that will take decades, if not more, to repair, and when the world, moreover, is facing a convulsion of climate change, which requires, that all hands come on deck, that some people are saying, well, no, we don't let you on deck because you have the wrong position on X or Y. I consider that unserious.
And not only that, Todd, again, the quote from Daniel Finn's article here, we don't need melodramatic hyperbole.
Right.
Yeah, it's amazing. So I guess what the open letter says here, to quote, all of us have charged for years that Trump is the leader of an authoritarian party that aims for absolute power, rejects climate science, embraces racism, sexism, homophobia, and violence, holds the democratic process in contempt, bids to take over the entire federal judiciary, represses voting rights, violates plain human decency on many fronts, So the reaction is, this is melodramatic hyperbole.
Right. They even said in that response to the open letter that if Trump had wanted to impose fascism, he would have done it already.
Yeah, and he's no Mussolini.
Right. Right. Although, you know what? All we're missing is a Mariotti murder.
Think about what this displays about historical knowledge, as if fascism is something that somebody arrives with a magic wand to entrance the public and to, people, we're talking about history. We're talking about millions of forces at work, millions of people, institutions at work. This is fairy tale politics you're talking about. You think somebody waves a wand and ushers in fascism? Good God!
And there was also to finish with the beating up of Jacobin, that after my op-ed, there were a number of pieces written, actually in newspapers all over the world, attacking me and my ideas. Some people knew who I was. I really wasn't put off by any of them. But then finally, the editor of Jacobin wrote an opinion piece in the Times, and which I thought was interesting for a number of reasons. One of them being, I received that in the Twitter mob and in responses that were written to what I wrote, I had disqualified myself by writing for the Times. So that Bhaskar Sunkara then writes in the Times, I thought was just like a delicious form of hypocrisy. But people congratulated me after his opinion piece appeared, because he seemed to be saying, no, nobody's saying not to vote for Biden, blah, blah, blah. But I looked at Jacobin that day, and God knows how that cost me to have to sully my eyeballs looking at Jacobin. It was full of attacks on Biden and on, people allowing themselves to be fooled that the Democrats were, in any substantial way different from the Republicans. So I actually even wrote to my editor at the Times to say that was just really wrong. He took advantage of the fact that nobody was going to check to see if what he was saying was the truth. But a story that I want to tell, though, Todd, because you were talking about demonstrations in thousands of cities. I've been going to demos since right after May 68. So sometime in the summer of 68, I went to my first demo. I was 16 years old. And so I've been to many demos. And I went to several around the Black Lives Matter stuff after George Floyd was killed, including an Orthodox Jewish march, which was absolutely the most surreal thing that I'd ever participated in, because it was it was in Midwood, it was on Ocean Parkway. Almost everybody, the men were all wearing yarmulkes, except me. The women were wearing snoods and they had shaitels on. And the sentiments were all exactly right. Maybe they were a little bit not as anti-police or not as opposed to the police as other demonstrations I've been to. Nevertheless, the signs all said the right thing. And then there was the most surreal moment of all. I forget which politician, an odious right-wing racist piece of shit who had actually gotten in trouble for dressing in blackface on Purim, nevertheless organized this demonstration. And he decided he wanted people to feel how long it was that knee was on George Floyd's neck. He said, we're all going to stand here. Let's just do it for a minute. And then everybody raised the clenched fist. So amongst all the snoods and the shaitels and the yarmulkes, there were all these clenched fists. And I have very little hope for this country, but just for that minute, I almost did.
Was that politician Dov Hikind? Are you thinking?
That's it. The Dov Hikind march, right?
Surprising.
Which was, by the way, talking about sectarianism again,
right?
Taken off the list of official demonstrations. My son had told me the night before, there's a demonstration on Ocean Parkway and Avenue J. You should go. And then in the next morning, he texted me to say, it's taken off the list because the organizer once put on blackface. And I said, you know what? I'll go. I'll see what it is. But, there were only a couple hundred people there in a neighborhood of tens of thousands of Orthodox Jews. Nevertheless, that there were any is a miracle on the order of the loaves and fishes.
Well, we want to talk also about the Harper's petition, but right before that, since you mentioned the protests in the Orthodox community, what are you thinking about in terms of what's going on in campus between some of the Palestinian and Israeli groups who are in various ways not able to talk to each other? Are we getting more civil there in the campus, on the campus, and some of these issues, are we completely separated? Just wonder if what your experiences are on campus. I
have none. So Todd,
I've been off campus for months now.
Right. Okay.
I don't know whether things are more civil or less civil. In a way that beside the point. I mean, I think clearly what's happened is that the American Jews overall are so low, revolted by the Netanyahu regime as to have, let's say, let their interest in the state of Israel as a decent republic wane, and their willingness to go to the mat against the boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement, I'd say, has weakened, because the state of Israel is acting in such a heinous way that the thought of either a one-state non-solution among people who hate each other, or two states between two peoples who increasingly, or in a continuing way, hate each other. I mean, it all seems like cloud cuckoo land. There's nothing, we're on ice. Nothing's going to happen. I have nothing to offer for a way out.
Yeah.
But I do think right now we have more urgent business, which is dealing with the American wing of the US, Brazil, Poland, Israel, Saudi Arabia, Turkey axis. That's the order of the day.
But on on the Harper's petition, though, Todd, I mean, that addresses issues. You know, what was the genesis of that?
I was sent it by Mark Lilla, who we both know. He said, "This is going around. You want to sign it?" I said, "Yes." He mentioned a few other people who were involved in it. Their names are mentioned in the Times today. If ever we needed a demonstration that there's a hysterical groupthink operating on the left, you'll find it in the reactions on Twitter and elsewhere to this rather anodyne statement that says, we think that people should have conversation, that we should be for justice and open speech. Because in chorus, hordes of people are saying, what do you mean there's groupthink on the left? What do you mean? You have no right to sign a statement because somebody else who signed the statement doesn't like trans people.
Right.
I mean, people, you know where you're living? And, by the way, I've signed a zillion statements. This is one statement I've signed. I'm not planning to make a crusade over the next 4 months about groupthink on campus. It's perfectly obvious to anybody around campus or in the press that this is going on. Right now, I do feel, like many others, the most urgent need is to get this creature out of the White House. So the fact that some people think it's more important to defend their purification ritual confirms exactly what the statement is deploring.
Right. And just for our audience, so they're following along with this, this is a letter on, as you mentioned, on justice and open debate, signed by 153 prominent artists and intellectuals. It's in the article in the Times today. It began with an acknowledgement of powerful protest for racial and social justice before pivoting to a warning against an intolerant climate engulfing the culture. The free exchange of information, ideas, the lifeblood of a liberal society is daily becoming more constricted. And it ends very simply. The cause of the letter is clear. It's a defense of people being able to speak and think freely without fear of punishment or retribution, of the right to disagree and not fear for your employment. And this is all what we're talking about here, too, in terms of fighting back and resisting an administration that is seeking to do just the opposite.
Well, some of it is, I'm sure some of the sentiment behind it is a lot of the excesses, come back to defacing statues of George Washington, defacing, the Shaw Memorial, turning over the statue of an abolitionist who was killed at the Battle of Chickamauga, criticizing the stances of people in the Emancipation monument, that all of this plays into the hands of, as Todd calls him, the monster that we need to remove. Because, what I realized today at the beach when I wasn't reading The Authoritarian Personality, while I was actually in the water, was that if you take down statues of Jefferson Davis, and he was a traitor, take down his statue. But you also insist, as several writers in the Times have said, that statues of George Washington and Thomas Jefferson have to come down, then you're saying George Washington equals Jefferson Davis. And that's something that only, to return to the subject of purity, the purest of the pure could possibly imagine. The one is the father of our country, the other is the one who tried to destroy our country. And I don't have a patriotic bone in my body. Nevertheless, it offends me as an American, as somebody who knows his country's history and knows just how hateful it is, and that there still were good people in it, to see George Washington put on the same plane as Jeb Stuart and Stonewall Jackson. It's not acceptable. But nobody on the left anyway, or it would take great courage on the left for anybody to write that, or to find somebody who would publish it. And that, I think, is what part of what the Harper's petition was addressing, especially the people that I know who signed it.
So again, it's a question of whether you're in this for purification,
right,
or you're in this with a tragic understanding that all nations' founding was polluted. All nations were founded by polluting forces that committed crimes. Period. There is no clean hands in the actual world. There are no clean hands. So if once you get into the iconoclastic mood of ripping the faces off the people you disapprove of, you leave a lot of rubble. What you don't leave is a viable political or social order. What you leave is an impossible ambition that serves only, I think, the power lust, whether acknowledged or unacknowledged, of those people who believe that they are the sole custodians of purity, of excellence, of acceptability. Nations are founded in bloodshed. And none of this is to say anything in favor of Christopher Columbus or George Washington, but it's the same thing if we're looking at the founding of the nation, the nations of Brazil or of Colombia or Argentina, of Chile. The Spanish Empire became 21 or 22 states, and the founding of all of them was genocidal. What are you going to do with that? What are you going to do with that? Well, I don't think there's a simple answer to that question.
But Todd,
but knowing it matters.
Yeah.
Well, and and further on that,
right.
I've read a couple of books in the last few weeks, and apparently the new thing in academia is settler colonialism, or it's the thing. So,
that's Rashid Khalidi's recent book as well.
Well, no, but you see that it was used in the 60s to describe Israel.
Right.
As a settler colonial state, Maxime Rodinson in that 900-page issue of L'État moderne. But now America is being called a settler colonialist state. So there's a recent history of St. Louis, my wife's hometown, that came out, in which everything that's been done since the founding of St. Louis is seen through the lens of settler colonialism, and thus it's delegitimized. And then there's a fabulous history of Jeffrey Ostler about the genocide of American Indians, where again he talks about America as a settler colonialist state. But again, as Todd said, what do you do with that information? Because should we all go back where we came from? Because in the case of Israel, the idea is to do away, at least in the 60s, although not from Rodin, was the state is illegitimate and the people shouldn't be there, and those who legitimately belong there are the Palestinians in Israel, and in America it would just be the Indians. But where am I going? I'm going partially to Odessa, partially to Romania, and then partly to, I don't even know where, my other, Minsk gubernia. But it's information. It's kind of like the joke about a neurologist, what he says is true and it's of absolutely no use. But that kind of delegitimizing the entire the existence of the American nation and the European presence on the continent, or in South America, the Spanish presence or the Portuguese presence, what do you do with it?
But Mitch, it's not either or, is it? Is it? I mean, first of all, you're going to stay in Brooklyn, so don't worry. You're not being.
Baruch Hashem.
All right. But we're talking about enhancing the narrative, adding to it, not subtracting. Let's admit to the past wrongs and go on from there in a spirit of radical love, if you will, in the spirit of Poor People's Campaign that Reverend Barber has been leading. That voices need to be included that haven't been.
You see, but that was the point of Howard Zinn and that whole school of history from the bottom up.
Okay.
That now this is a whole different thing, because history from the bottom up still meant that the little people who built the country, of whatever color, had a legitimate place in our history that had been cast aside and ignored. But by calling the whole enterprise a colonial, settler state, delegitimizes everybody who's here and everything that was done. That's just my little almost right-wing rant.
Including the conversations that the would-be Purification Caucus is having on Zoom, and the jobs that, if they're lucky, they're filling, that are occupying land that once belonged to Native Americans. I mean, history is tragic, folks. We don't get to start it by pressing a button at point zero. It's never year zero. It's always year N. And there it is,
We'll come back to Todd. Well, Mitch, I mean, but we're not, again, we're talking about nuances here, subtleties.
But there's nothing subtle about calling America a colonial settler state. There is no, that's history with like an axe. So, and that also feeds into, doing away with the statues of everybody. It's all part of the same, mentality. We keep coming back to, to purity.
But are there ways of bringing people together, respecting or trying to understand that history, putting some of those statues within a certain historical social context, in a museum, so on? Is that ways of doing that without denigrating someone else in the process of trying to uplift your own people?
Well, we're almost out of time. I think we've lost Todd here. But, but there was something, and I'll do this fast because we only have a couple minutes to go.
We do.
Many years ago, I went to Hungary. I've been to Hungary before, while it was still socialist, and then after the fall. And outside of Budapest, there's something called Sobor Park, Memento Park. And they had to face the question of, what do we do with statues of Lenin, of heroic Red Army men, of Bela Kun, of the people who fought in the 1919 revolution? And they didn't destroy them. What they did was they took all the statues from all over Budapest and put it in a park on the outskirts of the city. And Trump wants to do that as a heroic gesture. This is like more of an ironic gesture, because you show up, you get off the bus in the middle of nowhere, and you're greeted by a Red Army man holding a Soviet flag. Right. But there is a way, and everything is contextualized, and you're given, the history of Hungary and Hungarian socialism and what happened and what went wrong.
This is unfair. This is unfair, Mitch. But I wanted to ask you, gosh, I think we have about a minute to go. I was very interested in your article on Fauda, And could you compare that documentary or the series Israelis with Our Boys, who you praised? In just a minute. I mean, there's what I think we need more of, the latter.
Well, right. Our Boys was willing to face like the ugly depths of Israeli reality, of the Israeli soul, whereas Fauda does nothing but pretending to critique or pretending to humanize the Palestinians while still allowing the Israelis to be supermen.
Right. To be the pure victors.
And even if they're impure, even if what they do is impure,
right,
they're still supermen. And it's kind of like The Wire.
It's justified.
Right.
Yeah.
The Wire goes to Israel because in The Wire, it didn't matter what they did. They were right because they were the cops who were fighting against all the evils and ills in the world. Fauda is exactly that without any of the subtlety or insight.
Well, we are up against the reality of pure time here.
That's right.
Mitch, this has been great. And Todd,
thank you.
Todd, this has been a great show. Really appreciate it. We'll have to do this again real soon. Thank you again so very much. This is Jim Vrettos saying goodbye on The Radical Imagination. We'll see you again next week. Here's Phil Oakes, Changes. Thank you again.
Sit by my side, come as close as the air, share in a memory of gray, and wander in my words, dream about the pictures that I play of changes. Green leaves of summer turn red in the fall, to brown and to yellow they fade, and then they have to die, trapped within the circle time parade of changes. Scenes of my young years were warm in my mind, visions of shadows that shine, till one day I returned and found they were the victims of the vines of changes. The world spinning madly, it drifts in the dark, swings through a hollow of haze, a race around the stars, a journey through the universe ablaze with changes. Moments of magic will glow in the night, all fears of the forest are gone, but when the morning breaks, they're swept away by golden drops of dawn of changes. Passions will part to a strange melody, as fires will sometimes burn cold, like petals in the wind. We're puppets to the silver strings of souls of changes. Your tears will be trembling, now we're somewhere else. One last cup of wine we will pour, and I'll kiss you one more time and leave you on the rolling river shores of changes. So sit by my side, come as close as the air, share in a memory of grace, wander in my words, dream about the pictures that I play of changes.